I rise today in opposition to secrecy. I rise in support of auditing the Federal Reserve. I rise in opposition to the lack of accountability at the Federal Reserve, an institution that has been shrouded in secrecy for far too long. The objective of my Federal Reserve Transparency Act is simple: to protect the interests of the average American by finding out where hundreds of billions of dollars are going. The Federal Reserve has the ability to create new money and spend it on whatever financial assets it wants, whenever it wants, while giving the new money to whichever banks it wants. Yet the average Joe and Jane from Main Street, if they printed their own money, they would be imprisoned as counterfeiters. Nowhere else but in Washington, D.C., would you find an institution with so much unchecked power. Creating new money naturally lowers interest rates, or the price of using money. Put another way, the Federal Reserve's unchecked printing press creates a price control on the cost of using money. Throughout our country's history, price controls have never worked, and the Fed's price control on interest rates is no exception. Think back to the housing bubble. Artificially low interest rates led to too many individuals buying, selling, and investing in the housing industry. This in turn led prices to soar, which ultimately led the economy to spiral all the way down to the Great Recession of 2008. Since the 2008 financial crisis, the Fed has increased its balance sheet from less than $1 trillion to an incredible $4.4 trillion. Although the Fed has created trillions of new dollars, it has become apparent that most of this money is not finding its way into the hands of average Americans. From 2009 to 2012, the incomes of the top 1% increased by a whopping 31%, while everyone else's increased by a measly 0.4%. The reason for this is simple. Big banks, corporations, and government entities receive the Fed's money long before anybody else, and they bid up the prices of assets before the rest of us can get to purchasing them. Former Federal Reserve Governor Kevin Walsh once referred to Fed's easy money policies as the reverse Robin Hood effect. If you had access to credit, if you've got a big balance sheet, the Fed has made you richer, he said in an interview. This is a way to make the well-to-do even more well-to-do. The side effect of this is uneven distribution of money. It becomes painfully apparent to many when you go to the grocery store. Over the past 15 years, the price of white bread has increased by over 50%, while the price of eggs has more than doubled. The cost of housing has also appreciated significantly in many areas. When adjusting for inflation, the price of housing in San Francisco has increased by 58% in just 25 years. Real household income, however, has declined 10% over the past 15 years. Higher rent and higher grocery bills cause low-income workers to incur more loans and credit card debt, which involve far higher interest rates than those that the banks and Wall Street are paying. These low-income workers do not get the luxury of receiving the Fed's newly created money first, nor do they have the luxury of receiving the near-zero interest rates that the wealthy do. As a result, one thing is for certain: the Fed's price control on interest rates acts as a hidden tax on the less well-to-do. The Fed also exacerbates income inequality by paying large commercial banks some $12 billion in interest, which is a departure from nearly a century of practice, while individual savers earn practically no interest as a result of Fed rate manipulation. There's a revolving door between the Fed, the Treasury, and Wall Street, a revolving door in a building that is all too eager to enrich big banks and asset holders at the expense of everyone else. I think that it's about time we pull back the curtain to uncover this cloak of secrecy for all to see. Who is receiving loans from the Fed today? Who is the Fed paying interest to? Are there any conflicts of interest in how these payments are determined? Are there any checks and balances on the size of these payments? The Federal Reserve Act actually forbids the Fed from buying some of the troubled assets they purchased in 2008, yet they did it anyway. Given all these unanswered questions, and given the sharp increase in risk of the Fed's balance sheet, isn't it unquestionably necessary for the Fed to be audited more thoroughly than in the past? My Audit the Fed bill is just 3 pages long. and simply says that the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, the nonpartisan apolitical agency in charge of auditing the Fed, should conduct a full and thorough audit. Currently, the GAO is not allowed to audit the Fed's monetary policy deliberations or the Fed's open market committee transactions. The GAO is prevented from looking into agreements with foreign central banks, which altogether makes the Fed audit in its current form virtually futile. When these restrictions were added to the audit in the 1970s, the GAO testified before Congress saying, "We do not see how we can satisfactorily audit the Federal Reserve System without authority to examine the largest single category of financial transactions and assets that it has." To grasp just how limited the current audit is, recall that in 2009, when Democratic Congressman Alan Grayson asked Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke which foreign countries received $500 billion in loans from the Fed, Bernanke was unwilling to name which countries or banks received the $500 billion worth of funds. That's right. The Fed swapped $500 billion to foreign countries in secret and did not even have the decency to report the details to anyone. But it gets worse. Democrat Senator Bernie Sanders also asked Bernanke who received $2.2 trillion that the Fed lent out during the financial crisis. Again, Bernanke refused to give a direct answer. In the 2011 Dodd-Frank law, Congress ordered a limited, one-time GAO audit of Fed actions during the financial crisis. That audit uncovered that the Fed lent over $16 trillion to domestic and foreign banks during the financial crisis, a figure we would have never known if we had only relied on the Fed's internal audit. Both Republicans and Democrats agree that it's absurd that we did not know where hundreds of billions of dollars worth of our money is going. In fact, last year my Audit the Fed bill received the support of nearly every Republican in the House and over 100 Democrats. Some say that an audit will politicize the Fed. I find this claim odd, given that both sides of the aisle support the bill. The GAO, which will do the audit, is a nonpartisan, independent agency that works for Congress. It does not lean Republican or Democrat, and it's not interested in influencing policy. I can't seem to understand how a simple check by the GAO to ensure that there are no conflicts of interest will politicize anything. But in any case, the Fed does not need to worry about the politicization of monetary policy. Its chairwoman, Janet Yellen, has already done that. Right before the 2014 midterm elections, Chairwoman Yellen delivered a speech in front of the Boston Conference on Economic Opportunity and Inequality. Her speech was riddled with Democratic talking points. Instead of criticizing a standard audit, maybe the individuals that work within our central bank should begin curbing their own actions. Unlike the actions of current Fed officials, my bipartisan bill will not increase the politicization of monetary policy. If anything, it will help to eliminate political sway by ridding the central bank of Wall Street and the Department of Treasury's influence. I don't want the Fed to be overseen by Congress for the purpose of politicizing monetary policy. I simply want it overseen to ensure that our central bank isn't picking favorites, and I also want to ensure that it remains solvent. Like every agency, the Federal Reserve was created by Congress and is supposed to be overseen by Congress. For the sake of everyday Americans and for the sake of our financial stability, I urge all of my colleagues, Republicans and Democrats alike, to join me in passing the Federal Reserve Transparency Act. Auditing the Fed should not be a partisan issue. Regardless of one's monetary policy views, regardless of whether you think interest rates should be higher or lower, everyone can and should agree that for the sake of our country's economic well-being, we need to know what has been going on behind the Federal Reserve's cloak of secrecy. It's time we quit this guessing game. It's time we audit the Federal Reserve once and for all to restore transparency to our nation's checkbook. Thank you, and I hope all will support this bill.